On the afternoon of May 29th, 1780, in a stand of open woods near the line between North and South Carolina, roughly 380 American soldiers formed a single rank and waited for a cavalry charge. 15 minutes later, 113 of them were dead. 150 more were wounded so severely they could not be carried from the field. 53 were prisoners. The British lost 5 men killed. And here is the detail that turned a minor engagement on a back road into one of the most consequential quarter hours of the American Revolution. Most of those American casualties were not inflicted while the two sides were fighting. They were inflicted afterward, after the line had broken, after the muskets had been grounded, after a white flag had gone up and been cut down. Battles produce casualties. Massacres produce evidence. And what happened in that field near the Waxhaws settlement left a very particular kind of evidence, not just in the letters of the men who survived it, but written into their bodies in wounds that would still be described in government paperwork 40 years later. We tend to remember the Revolution as a war of ideas, declarations, conventions, arguments about representation. But in the Carolinas in 1780, it stopped being that. It became something older and uglier, neighbors hunting neighbors, and a war in which the phrase "no quarter" stopped being a legal term and became a promise. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how 270 exhausted men, riding horses that were dying underneath them, destroyed a larger force of trained Continental regulars in about the time it takes to boil a kettle of water. You'll understand the single order Colonel Abraham Buford gave, an order that sounds courageous, that would have been correct in almost any other tactical situation, and that in this one guaranteed his men would be killed. You'll hear the argument that historians are still having about whether Banastre Tarleton ordered a massacre, lost control of one, or something more uncomfortable than either. You'll see what a statistical analysis of Revolutionary War pension applications, filed decades later by old men seeking a few dollars a month, revealed about the wounds these soldiers carried. It's some of the strangest forensic evidence in early American history, and it points in one direction, and you'll follow the consequences outward, from a country church converted into a hospital, to a 13-year-old boy carrying water to mutilated men, to a mountainside in October where American militia would repay this afternoon with interest, screaming a phrase that had not existed 6 months earlier. By the standards of the war, Waxhaws is a small battle. 380 men on one side, 270 on the other. No general officers present, no city taken, no army destroyed, no treaty signed. It is also arguably the moment the British lost the American South. To understand how, we have to go back 3 weeks to a harbor city on fire. By the winter of 1779, the war was 5 years old, and the British had a problem they could not solve with victories. They had won plenty of them: New York, Philadelphia, Brandywine, Germantown. They had taken every major city they had seriously tried to take. And it had accomplished remarkably little, because the Continental Army kept doing the one thing an army is not supposed to do when it loses. It kept existing. George Washington had turned strategic retreat into a form of warfare. Every time the British captured a place, they discovered that capturing places was not the same as winning. Worse, the war had gone international. France had come in openly in 1778. Spain followed in 1779. What had begun as a colonial insurrection was now a global conflict. With British possessions in the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and India all suddenly vulnerable. London could no longer pour unlimited resources into North America. Whatever was going to be done in the colonies had to be done efficiently, and it had to be done soon. So the British High Command changed the question. Instead of asking how to defeat the American army, they began asking how to make the American army irrelevant. The answer they arrived at was the Southern strategy, and its logic was seductive. The premise was that the Southern colonies were fundamentally different from New England. Georgia and the Carolinas, the reasoning went, contained enormous numbers of people who had never wanted this war, who remained loyal to the crown, and who had simply been intimidated into silence by an aggressive patriot minority. These people were not rebels. They were hostages. Remove the rebel authorities, the theory went, and the loyal population would surface. Arm them, organize them into provincial militia, and hand the countryside back to them. British regulars would take the ports and the key towns. Loyalist Americans would hold everything in between. Then, with the South secured and functioning as a base, the whole apparatus would roll north. It was, in modern terms, a plan to win a war through counterinsurgency and local partnership rather than through decisive battle. And on paper, it was intelligent. It also depended entirely on an assumption about how people behave, and that assumption was about to be tested. The first phase went almost perfectly. Savannah fell in December of 1778. Georgia's royal government was restored, the only colony where that actually happened. Encouraged, Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief in North America, assembled a major amphibious force and went after the real prize. Charleston, South Carolina, was the fourth largest city in the 13 colonies and by some distance the richest in the South. It was the commercial heart of the region, the point through which rice and indigo left and manufactured goods arrived, and the political center of the state. It was also, geographically, a trap, built on a narrow peninsula between two rivers, easy to blockade, difficult to escape. American Major General Benjamin Lincoln knew this. He also knew that abandoning Charleston meant abandoning South Carolina, and the state's civilian leadership made it clear they expected the city to be held. So Lincoln did what commanders have done throughout history when politics overrules geography. He put his army inside the trap and hoped. The siege began in earnest in the spring of 1780. The British landed, worked their way up the peninsula, and began the patient, mathematical work of siege engineering. Parallel trenches dug closer and closer to the defensive works, artillery advanced by increments, the noose tightening by yards per day. The Royal Navy forced the harbor. American ships were scuttled to block the channel and accomplished nothing. By early May, British batteries were close enough to fire heated shot into the city. Buildings burned. Civilians who had demanded the city be defended began petitioning for surrender. On May 12, 1780, Benjamin Lincoln surrendered Charleston and everything in it. The scale of the disaster is difficult to overstate. More than 5,000 American soldiers marched out and laid down their arms. Continental regulars and militia together, the largest single surrender of American forces in the entire war, and one that would not be surpassed until the Civil War. With them went artillery, muskets, powder, and supplies that the Southern theater could not replace. In a single morning, the organized Continental Army in the South ceased to exist. Clinton had his victory. He also had New York to worry about, and a French fleet somewhere in the Atlantic, so he did what commanders-in-chief do. He collected the credit, took a substantial portion of the army, and sailed north. Command of the Southern Theater passed to his deputy. That deputy was Lieutenant General Charles, Lord Cornwallis, and Cornwallis was a different kind of soldier from Clinton. More aggressive, more willing to gamble, considerably less patient. Where Clinton would consolidate, Cornwallis would push. He pushed immediately. Columns went out from Charleston into the back country to plant garrisons at Camden, at 96, at Augusta, and Georgetown. A lattice of posts intended to hold the interior and, more importantly, to serve as rallying points where Loyalists could come in, be armed, and be organized. Major Patrick Ferguson, a Scottish officer with an unusual gift for training irregulars, was given the job of building that Loyalist militia across the western districts. Everything was proceeding according to the plan. There was only one loose thread. Somewhere north of Camden, moving slowly up the roads toward the North Carolina line, was the last organized regiment of Continental Regulars in South Carolina. If you're finding this useful, subscribing genuinely helps the channel. And there's a lot more of this coming. Now, that column. The men Cornwallis wanted had never intended to be in South Carolina at all. They were relief that had arrived too late. When it became clear over the winter that Charleston was going to be besieged, Virginia had been asked to send help. What Virginia sent was a detachment built around the 7th Virginia Regiment, with 2 companies of the 2nd Virginia attached, a small artillery contingent with 2 6-pounder guns, and about 40 Virginia light dragoons for scouting and screening. Somewhere between 350 and 380 men in total, depending on which return you believe and on what day you count. These were not militia. This is worth being precise about, because it matters for everything that follows. These were Continentals, enlisted regulars of the National Army, uniformed, drilled, and paid, or at least owed pay. They knew how to hold a line under fire. They knew the manual of arms. In an army where most of the fighting in the South would soon be done by part-time farmers with hunting rifles, this was a professional unit. Their commander was Colonel Abraham Buford, a Virginian in his early 30s who had been in the war since 1775. He had served in the northern campaigns, he had been promoted on merit, and by every indication he was a competent, conventional officer of the kind the Continental Army had spent 5 years painstakingly producing. Nothing in his record before that. May suggests a man out of his depth. What the record does show is a man handed an impossible march. Buford's detachment had come south overland, hundreds of miles down through Virginia and into the Carolinas, in the spring, on roads that were mostly ruts. They were still on the road when the news came north to meet them. Charleston had surrendered. There was no longer a siege to relieve, no longer an army to reinforce, and no longer any friendly force between them and the entire British Southern Command. Buford turned around. And here his real problem began, because turning around is not the same as escaping. He was moving a column that included a heavy baggage train, 2 6-pounder cannons, and wagons of supplies that had been dragged 400 miles and that the Continental cause could not afford to lose. Artillery in 1780 moved at the pace of the horses hauling it, which on a bad road meant slower than a walking man. Every one of those wagons was an anchor. He was also carrying passengers. John Rutledge was the Patriot governor of South Carolina, and by that spring, in a real sense, the Patriot government of South Carolina. The legislature had granted him emergency powers before the siege closed. He had escaped Charleston before the surrender specifically, so that the state's civil authority would not go into a British prison with Lincoln's army. As long as Rutledge was free, South Carolina had a government in exile. If he were captured, the British could plausibly claim the state had been not just conquered, but legally restored to the crown. Rutledge, along with several prominent refugees from Charleston, was traveling under the protection of Buford's column, heading for the temporary safety of Hillsborough, North Carolina. So Buford was moving slowly, in hostile country, encumbered by guns and wagons he would not abandon, escorting the single most valuable political prisoner the British could possibly take, with a demoralized command that had just learned the army it came to save no longer existed. British intelligence knew all of it. This is one of the underappreciated advantages the British held in the South that summer, and it flowed directly from the Southern strategy actually working, at first. In a countryside with a genuine loyalist population, an army on the march gets told things. Which road the enemy took, how many wagons, who was riding with them. Cornwallis's staff had a reasonably accurate picture of Buford's column, its speed, and its cargo. And Cornwallis understood the arithmetic of the situation better than anyone. The Continental Army in the South was gone. Buford's detachment was the last organized fragment of it left in the state. If it escaped into North Carolina, it became a seed. A professional nucleus that recruits could be organized around, that militia could be attached to, that could grow back into an army over the summer. If it were destroyed, South Carolina would have no continental presence at all. And the loyalist recruiting Ferguson was doing would proceed without any organized force to contest it. Add the possibility of capturing Governor Rutledge, and the calculation was obvious. Cornwallis put a column on the road himself and started north. But he could see he was too slow. His infantry and his supply train could not close a gap of several days against a column already moving. He needed someone who could travel light, travel fast, and hit hard on arrival without waiting for the main body. He had exactly that officer, and that officer had already built a reputation for doing precisely this kind of work. Banastre Tarleton was 25 years old, 3 months short of 26, and he was the most talked about junior officer in the British Army in America. He had been born in Liverpool in 1754, into money. The Tarleton family fortune came from Atlantic commerce, and it is not possible to describe that commerce honestly without saying plainly what it was. The family firm dealt in West Indian sugar and in the transatlantic trade in enslaved human beings. His father served as mayor of Liverpool. The wealth was substantial, the social position secure, and Banastre was a third son, which meant he would inherit something but never the bulk of it. He was educated at Oxford and entered the Middle Temple to read law, which he did with no visible enthusiasm and considerable enthusiasm for gambling. When his father died in 1773, Tarleton came into an inheritance of several £1,000s and lost most of it at cards and dice inside a couple of years. In 1775, with the family fortune considerably lighter and a war beginning across the ocean, his mother purchased him a commission. He entered the 1st Dragoon Guards as a cornet, the most junior commissioned rank in a cavalry regiment, and sailed for America. What happened next is the part that complicates any easy reading of him. Tarleton turned out to be extraordinarily good at war. He was a superb horseman in an era when that was a genuine professional skill. He had physical courage that nobody, including his enemies, ever questioned. He had stamina that bordered on inhuman. He could ride for 18 hours, sleep for 3, and ride again. And he possessed the specific temperamental gift that makes light cavalry commanders effective and dangerous. He made decisions instantly, and he was almost never troubled by them afterward. He served in the operations around New York and in the Philadelphia campaign. In December of 1776, as part of a small raiding party, he took part in the capture of American Major General Charles Lee, at that moment arguably the second most important officer in the Continental Army. Taken at a tavern in New Jersey, still in his dressing gown. It was a spectacular piece of light cavalry opportunism, and it made Tarleton's name. By 1778, at 23, he was a lieutenant colonel, and he was given command of a new formation that would define the rest of his career. The British Legion was not a regiment of the British Isles. This is the fact that most casual accounts of Waxhaws get wrong, and it changes the meaning of everything that happened. The Legion was a provincial corps raised in New York, and it was composed of American loyalists. It was assembled by merging several smaller loyalist units, among them the Caledonian Volunteers, the West Jersey Volunteers, and the Philadelphia Light Dragoons. The men in it were colonials who had chosen the crown, many of them from precisely the middle colonies where the fighting had been most bitter, many of them driven from their homes and property by patriot committees. They were, in other words, men with grievances. And when the Legion rode into South Carolina, the war it was fighting was not England against America. It was Americans against Americans, which is historically the version that goes worst. The Legion was designed as a flying corps, a self-contained combined arms formation that could operate independently well ahead of any main body. Roughly half cavalry, half light infantry, with the infantry mounted for movement so the whole unit could travel at cavalry speed and then fight with two different capabilities on arrival. In an army whose doctrine was still largely built around massed infantry and set-piece engagements, this was a fast, flexible, modern instrument, and Tarleton used it the way it was designed to be used. They were also visually unmistakable. The Legion did not wear British red. They wore short green jackets faced in black, with white buckskin breeches, practical for hard riding, distinctive on a battlefield, and by 1780, a color scheme that carried its own meaning in the Carolina backcountry. Their headgear became famous enough to be named after him. The Tarleton helmet was a hard cap of boiled leather, with a black crest of bearskin running front to back. Designed to be light enough for a rider and tough enough to turn a saber cut aimed at the skull. When Sir Joshua Reynolds painted Tarleton a few years later, a portrait that made him a celebrity, the helmet was in it. Cavalry officers across Europe would eventually adopt versions of it. So this was the man Cornwallis sent after Buford, 25, aggressive to a fault, commanding a unit of exiled Americans with scores to settle, already carrying, at least among the patriots of South Carolina, an ugly reputation. Because Waxhaws was not the first time. 6 weeks earlier, in mid-April, the Legion had surprised an American cavalry force at Monk's Corner outside Charleston in a night attack. The action itself was a legitimate and well-executed operation. What happened afterward was not. There were credible reports of the Legion plundering the surrounding countryside and of assaults on women at a nearby plantation. Serious enough that a British officer, Major Patrick Ferguson, reportedly proposed that the men responsible be shot on the spot, and serious enough that the accused had to be sent back to Charleston. That episode matters for the argument we're going to have later in this video, and it matters for a specific reason. It establishes that before Waxhaws, this particular unit had already demonstrated that its discipline could fail, and that its commander had already been in a position to see it fail and to do something about it. For the pursuit, Tarleton assembled a strike force built for speed rather than staying power. He took 130 Legion dragoons, his cavalry, the shock element. He took 100 Legion infantry, mounted for the march, riding double behind the dragoons where necessary, who would fight dismounted with muskets. He took 40 regulars of the 17th Light Dragoons, a British regular cavalry regiment, hard professionals who provided a stiffening core to a provincial unit. And he took a single 3-pounder field gun, the lightest artillery piece that could still be called artillery. Roughly 270 men, total, against a Continental detachment of 380. He was outnumbered, riding into open country, chasing an enemy with several days' head start in the heat of a Carolina May. On the numbers, this should not have worked at all. What Tarleton understood, and what makes him uncomfortably worth studying, is that in this situation, the numbers were the least important variable. The important variable was time. If he arrived fast enough, none of the rest of it would matter. So he set out to do something that even his enemies would later describe as remarkable. The pursuit that led to Waxhaws is, on its own terms and setting aside entirely what happened at the end of it, one of the most punishing forced marches in the history of cavalry operations in North America. Tarleton left the main British column at Nelson's Ferry on the Santee River on May 27th. Understand what he was starting with. Buford had a lead of several days and perhaps 100 miles. The country between them was rough. Sandy roads, pine barrens, creek crossings, and stretches where the track was little better than a path through scrub. And it was late May in the South Carolina interior, which meant heat that arrived early in the morning and did not release until well after dark, with the kind of humidity that makes exertion genuinely dangerous for animals. On the first day, Tarleton's column covered 60 miles. That number deserves a moment. 60 miles in a day is not an ordinary cavalry march. A standard day's movement for mounted troops in this period was somewhere between 20 and 35 miles, and 35 was considered hard use. 60 miles in a single day, in that heat, with infantry riding double on horses already carrying a rider and equipment, is the sort of march that permanently damages a unit's horseflesh. They arrived at Camden on the afternoon of May 28th, and Tarleton did what he always did on arrival. He went looking for information. Camden was a market town in a district with a substantial Loyalist population, and the intelligence he got was immediately valuable. Buford's column had been at Rugeley's Mill, a plantation about 12 miles further on, the previous day. Governor Rutledge had been with them. They were still moving north, and they were moving slowly because of the wagons. 12 miles. After a 100-mile chase, the gap was 12 miles and 1 day. Tarleton let his men rest for a few hours. Then he had them up at 2 o'clock in the morning on May 29th and back on the road in the dark. The second day broke the column. Horses began to fail, not stumbling and slowing, but collapsing and dying on the road from heat exhaustion. Every animal that went down created a cascading problem, because a Legion infantryman without a horse either doubled up on someone else's failing mount or fell behind and was effectively lost to the pursuit. Men were dropped along the route because there was nothing left to carry them. Then the guns went. Or rather, the gun, the single 3-pounder. The horses assigned to haul it simply could not do it any longer. And Tarleton did the thing that most commanders of his era found nearly unthinkable. He left his artillery by the side of the road and kept going. Think about what that decision reveals. He was about to attack a force larger than his own, which had 2 guns of its own, and he chose to arrive without any artillery at all, rather than arrive an hour later with it. Everything about how Tarleton fought is contained in that choice. Speed was not a supporting factor in his method. Speed was his method, and he would trade almost anything for it. By the early afternoon of May 29th, his forward riders came in sight of horsemen on the road ahead, Buford's rear guard, near a Scots-Irish farming settlement called the Waxhaws that straddled the border between the 2 Carolinas. 105 miles, 54 hours. His men had been in the saddle almost continuously for 2.5 days in brutal heat. They had slept perhaps a few hours total. Their horses were finished, not tired, finished, in the sense that a significant portion of them would never be fit for service again. The unit was strung out for miles behind the vanguard, with stragglers and dismounted men scattered along the entire route. This is the thing about Waxhaws that gets lost. When those 2 forces met, the British were in far worse physical condition than the Americans. Buford's men were demoralized and encumbered, but they had been marching at a normal pace, sleeping at night, and eating. Tarleton's men were, in any objective assessment, wrecked. He had one advantage, and it was psychological. Buford did not know that. There was one piece of business the pursuit had already failed at, though Tarleton did not yet know it either. Governor Rutledge had been warned that fast-moving British cavalry were on the road behind him. Some hours earlier, he had detached himself from the column with a small escort and ridden hard for North Carolina. The most valuable prize in the pursuit was already gone. What remained on that road was 380 Continental soldiers, their wagons and their colors. Tarleton had a serious problem and roughly an hour to solve it. His combat power was arriving in pieces. The vanguard was up, but the rest of the column was scattered back along miles of road, and the longer this took, the more men would come in. But also the more time Buford had to keep marching toward the North Carolina line and whatever safety that represented. If Buford simply kept moving, Tarleton would be forced into a running fight against a formed body of regulars with fragments of an exhausted command, which is the kind of engagement that gets cavalry commanders killed. He needed Buford to stop, so he sent a letter. Under a white flag, an officer named Captain David Kinloch rode forward to Buford's column carrying a demand for surrender. And the document Kinloch delivered is one of the more instructive pieces of paper in the war, because almost nothing in it was true. Tarleton told Buford he was nearly surrounded. He described a force of 700 light troops on horseback, split between infantry and cavalry with artillery. He added that Lord Cornwallis himself was close behind, with 9 British battalions. He framed the offer as a mercy, an opportunity to prevent unnecessary bloodshed, extended once, not to be repeated. The letter itself survives, and the phrasing is worth hearing directly because you can feel the pressure being applied. Resistance being vain, to prevent the effusion of human blood, I make offers which can never be repeated. Now compare that to reality. Tarleton had roughly 270 men, most of them not yet on the field. He had no artillery because it was lying in the road 20 miles back. Cornwallis and his battalions were days away and closing at the speed of marching infantry. Every operational claim in the document was a lie. It was a bluff, executed with total confidence by a man who had correctly identified that his enemy had no way of checking. And it was aimed at a specific vulnerability. Buford's men already knew Charleston had fallen. They knew 5,000 of their countrymen had surrendered 3 weeks earlier. They knew there was no American army left in the state to come and get them. A message announcing that they were surrounded by an overwhelming force was not implausible to men in that psychological position. It was exactly what they were already afraid of. Buford halted the column and called his officers together. What was said in that meeting comes down to us primarily through one man. Dr. Robert Brownfield was a surgeon's mate with the detachment, a junior medical officer, which meant he was present for everything and responsible for the aftermath. Years later, he wrote an account of the day in a letter to Judge William Dobain James, and that letter became the foundation of nearly everything Americans would come to believe about Waxhaws. We'll come back to Brownfield's reliability because it's genuinely contested and it matters. But on the Council of War, his account is detailed and internally coherent, and no competing version seriously contradicts it. According to Brownfield, Buford laid 3 options in front of his officers. The first was to accept Tarleton's terms and surrender the detachment. The second was to abandon the baggage and the artillery entirely, put every man who could ride on a horse and everyone else on his feet, and run for the North Carolina line unencumbered. The third was to stop, form a defensive position using the wagons as a barricade, and fight it out where they stood. They rejected the first immediately, and their reasoning was sound. Tarleton's letter was unverified. It came from an officer with an obvious interest in exaggerating, delivered at the exact moment when exaggeration would be most useful to him. The officer suspected, correctly, entirely correctly, that the claim of 700 troops was a ruse. To hand over a regiment of Continental regulars on the unsupported word of the enemy commander would have been, in the professional culture of that army, close to disgraceful. They rejected the second as well, and this is where hindsight becomes painful. Abandoning the baggage was the militarily correct answer. It was almost certainly the answer that saves 200 lives. But you have to see it the way they did. Those wagons contained supplies that had been hauled hundreds of miles into a theater that had just lost everything it had. The 2 6-pounders were, at that moment, a meaningful fraction of the Continental artillery remaining in the Southern Department. Throwing all of it into a ditch to outrun cavalry that would then simply capture it, was not a decision a colonel could make lightly, and it carried an implication about his own conduct that would follow him. There is also a practical point that gets underrated. Abandoning your baggage does not actually let infantry outrun cavalry. It lets them go slightly faster while being run down slightly later, strung out along a road without formation. Buford's officers may well have judged that option as a slower death rather than an escape. The third option, the wagon fort, was rejected too, and their reasoning here was strategic rather than tactical. Suppose it worked. Suppose they threw back Tarleton's cavalry from behind a barricade which was entirely achievable. What then? They would be a static, surrounded force in hostile country with no relief coming, waiting for Cornwallis and his battalions to arrive and reduce them at leisure. A successful defense on May 29th just meant a surrender on June 2nd. Every option was bad. That is the honest summary of Buford's position, and any account that treats his decision as simple foolishness is not taking the situation seriously. What they chose was a fourth thing, the option not on the list. Keep the wagons rolling north under escort and stand and fight in the open with the infantry to buy them the time to get clear. It did not work. The British took the baggage train regardless. Roughly 26 wagons and both 6-pounder guns fell into Tarleton's hands before the day was over. Buford declined to abandon his supplies in order to save his men, and by evening he had lost the supplies and the men both. That is the sentence that has followed him for 240 years, and it is not an unfair one. Buford sent Tarleton back a single line. "Sir, I reject your proposals, and shall defend myself to the last extremity." It is a good sentence. It is the sentence a Continental colonel was supposed to write. And within the hour, it would be quoted back at him with the bitterest possible irony, because the last extremity turned out to be exactly what his men received. Tarleton got what he needed from the exchange. Not a surrender. He probably never expected one. What he got was a stopped column and a formed enemy standing in one place, which meant a battle on his terms rather than a pursuit on Buford's. The bluff had already done its work before the reply arrived. Buford formed his line in open woodland to the right of the Great Waxhaw Road. The ground deserves attention because it explains part of what followed. This was not dense forest, which would have broken up a cavalry charge and given infantry an enormous advantage. It was open woods, mature trees with clear ground between them, the sort of terrain the Carolina backcountry produced in abundance, where a horse could move at speed and a rider could see. For a cavalry commander, it was nearly ideal. For infantry standing without cover, it was very close to the worst place to be. He deployed his roughly 350 infantrymen in a single line, one rank deep in the linear formation standard for the period, with the regimental colors of the 3rd Virginia Detachment planted in the center. There were no obstacles anchoring the flanks, no fence line, no creek, no rough ground. There was no second line and no reserve. The 40 Virginia Dragoons and the artillery were with the baggage, moving north, and so were effectively out of the battle before it started. Whatever was going to happen would happen to 350 muskets in a single, unsupported rank. And then Buford gave the order that decided the day. He told his men to hold their fire until the British cavalry was within 10 yards. I want to be careful here because this order gets described as stupidity, and it is not that. It comes from a real and correct piece of 18th century tactical doctrine, and understanding why it was normally right is the only way to understand why it was catastrophically wrong on this particular afternoon. Muskets in 1780 were inaccurate and slow. A smooth-bore musket at 100 yards was a coin flip against a formation. At 30 yards, it was devastating. A trained infantryman could load and fire perhaps 3 times in a minute under ideal conditions, considerably slower under fire. This meant that in an infantry engagement, the first volley was the single most valuable thing a commander possessed, and spending it early was the classic amateur's mistake. Holding fire until the enemy was close, then delivering everything at once into a packed formation, could break an attack outright. It required extraordinary discipline. It was the mark of a good regiment. It won battles. Against advancing infantry, this order is correct. Against charging cavalry, it is fatal, and the reason is physics. A galloping horse covers roughly 10 yards in 1 second. When Buford's men fired at 10 yards, the surviving riders were among them in about the time it takes to blink. There was no interval, none at all, in which the infantry could reload, and no interval in which they could fix bayonets, which was the only thing that made a foot soldier survivable against a horseman. The volley and the impact were effectively simultaneous. Worse, at 10 yards, even the horses you kill keep coming. A cavalry charge at full gallop carries momentum that does not care about the health of the animal. Dead horses at that range arrive as projectiles. Killing the front rank of a charge at point-blank distance does not stop the charge. It just means the front rank arrives on the ground instead of on its feet, still moving forward, still hitting your line. The counter to cavalry was known, and it was not a volley. It was a square or solid mass, presenting a hedge of bayonets in every direction, a formation that horses will physically refuse to enter, because horses will not run into a wall of spear points. Alternatively, it was broken ground, or obstacles, or a hasty barricade. Anything that let infantry meet cavalry with something other than open flesh. Buford chose none of these. He put a thin line in open ground and told it to wait. Why? We don't know, and honest history has to stop there rather than invent a motive. The most sympathetic reading is that he was still thinking about the fight as an infantry engagement, and that 100 yards of open ground and a rising line of dust does not give a man very long to reconsider his entire tactical framework. The least sympathetic is that he had never faced a mounted charge and did not correctly imagine what one was. Whatever the reason, Tarleton was watching, and Tarleton had faced a great many infantry lines. He divided his force into 3 columns, and the design of that attack is worth setting out clearly, because it is a genuinely skillful piece of work by a man whose troops were falling out of their saddles from exhaustion. On the British right, opposite the American left, Major Charles Cochrane took 60 Legion Dragoons and about 50 mounted infantry. Their job was not to charge. They were to dismount and open fire, pinning the American left in place with musketry, holding it, preventing it from wheeling or shifting to support the center. In the center, the regulars of the 17th Light Dragoons stiffened with 40 Legion dragoons, were to charge straight into the American center, directly at the regimental colors. In 18th century warfare, the colors were not decoration. They were how a unit knew where it was, how orders were transmitted visually through smoke, and where the formation's cohesion physically lived. Aiming a charge at the colors is aiming at a unit's nervous system. On the British left, Tarleton personally took 30 dragoons and swung wide around the American right, driving for the rear, for the reserves and the baggage, and in practice, for the line of retreat. Note what this plan does: pin the left, break the center, cut the escape. 350 men in a single line have no answer to it, because a single line has no depth and therefore no capacity to respond to anything at all. Once it breaks anywhere, it is finished everywhere. At roughly 300 yards, the British cavalry began to move. 300 yards is about 20 seconds at a gallop. That is the whole interval, from the moment the American line saw the British start forward to the moment the horses arrived. 20 seconds, perhaps 30, allowing for the pace building through a trot and a canter before the final run. By every account we have, the Virginians did not break during it. This is worth dwelling on, because the way this battle is usually remembered flattens it into a rout. And it was not a rout at the start. 350 men stood in open ground and watched cavalry come at them at a dead run, and held their muskets leveled and did not fire and did not run, and waited, through a distance that must have felt geological, until the order came at 10 yards. Then they fired all at once. The volley did real damage. Saddles emptied. Horses went down in a tangle at the front of the charge. Among the animals killed was Tarleton's own mount, shot beneath him in the first instant of contact. And it changed nothing. The surviving riders came through the smoke of their own dead and into the American rank without any pause at all. Men who had just discharged their weapons were standing with empty muskets and no bayonets fixed when horsemen with sabers arrived among them at speed. What follows is not a battle in any meaningful sense. There is a specific, ugly thing that happens when cavalry gets in among unformed infantry. And it is not combat. It is butchery in the technical sense, in that one side is doing all of the killing. A saber wielded from horseback against a man on foot is delivered downward with the weight and speed of the horse behind it. A standing infantryman's options are to run, to go to the ground, or to try to parry a cavalry saber with a musket barrel. The American center collapsed almost immediately. On the left, Cochrane's dismounted infantry were doing their work. On the right, Tarleton's 30 riders had already gone around and were coming in from behind. And within a minute or two of the first contact, the men in that line understood, the way soldiers do without needing to be told, that this was over, and that the only remaining question was whether they would be allowed to surrender. Under the conventions of 18th century European warfare, that question had a standard answer. Quarter was not a courtesy. It was closer to a contract, and it was one of the few things about that era's warfare that functioned reliably. A beaten force could signal submission. Grounding arms, raising a white cloth, calling for quarter, and the victor was expected to accept it. Prisoners were taken, officers were paroled, the wounded were treated. This was not humanitarian sentiment. It was practical self-interest built up over centuries, because armies that refuse quarter discover very quickly that their own men are refused it in turn, and that enemies with nothing to gain by surrendering fight to the death every single time. Both sides in this war understood the convention. Both had generally honored it. At the Waxhaws, it failed completely. And the argument about why it failed is the reason this battle is still contested 240 years later. 3 separate things happened in the space of perhaps 90 seconds, and their combination is what produced the atrocity. The first was that Banastre Tarleton disappeared. When his horse was shot in the American volley, it went down hard and pinned him underneath it. He was not seriously injured. He was, however, out of sight and out of communication at the precise moment his unit made contact with the enemy. Trapped under a dead animal in the middle of a melee, unable to see the field, unable to issue an order, unable to be seen issuing one. And in the smoke and confusion, a rumor went through the Legion that their commander had been killed. Tarleton addressed this himself years afterward. In the memoir of the Southern campaigns he published in 1787, his account is self-serving, obviously. It is a defense written by a man who by then had been called a butcher in print for 7 years. But his explanation of the mechanism is plausible, and it is the only first-hand explanation we have from the British side. He wrote that the belief that he had been killed stimulated his soldiers to what he called a vindictive asperity not easily restrained. Strip the 18th century phrasing, and he is saying, "They thought I was dead. They went mad, and nobody could stop them." The second was that Abraham Buford tried to surrender, and the attempt failed catastrophically. Seeing his line shattered and his men being cut down where they stood, Buford ordered his adjutant, an ensign named Cruet, to go forward with a white flag. Every American account of what happened next agrees, and they agree in a way that is difficult to dismiss as coordinated invention, because they come from men who were scattered afterward and never had an opportunity to reconcile their stories. Cruet went forward with the flag. The flag was ignored. Cruet was sabred down where he stood, holding it. I want to flag something about this moment that often goes unexamined. It is entirely possible that no British soldier consciously refused that flag. In a melee, with dust and powder smoke, with 130 horsemen at close quarters and men screaming, an ensign holding a white cloth is a man standing upright in the middle of a cavalry charge. He may have been cut down by someone who never registered what he was carrying. That reading is genuinely possible for the first 30 seconds. It becomes much harder to sustain for the following 15 minutes. The third was that Buford left. With his adjutant killed under a flag of truce and his regiment being destroyed, Colonel Abraham Buford got on a horse and rode off the field. He was not alone. A number of his mounted officers went with him, and he survived the war and continued to serve. But the fact remains, and it is the fact that would define his reputation for the rest of his life and long after it. The commanding officer left his men on that ground while they were being killed. He would spend years defending the decision. It is not indefensible. A colonel who stays to be captured or killed accomplishes nothing for anyone. And there was an argument that he was needed to report what had happened and to reconstitute what could be reconstituted. But it is also true that Buford's departure removed the last possible source of an organized, authoritative surrender from the American side. So consider the situation on that field. Roughly 2 minutes after the first contact, the British commander is pinned under a dead horse, invisible, and widely believed by his own men to be dead. The American commander has left the field. The American adjutant, who was carrying the only formal offer of surrender, has been killed. There is no chain of command on either side. There are 350 broken, mostly unarmed men on the ground, and there are 200 and something exhausted, enraged loyalist cavalrymen, among them with sabers. Nobody was in charge of what happened next. That is not an excuse. As we'll see, it is not even a complete explanation. But it is the mechanism, and any honest account of Waxhaws has to start by acknowledging that this specific, unusual compounding failure is what created the conditions. What followed lasted about a quarter of an hour. Our fullest account is Brownfield's. The surgeon's mate, writing years later, describing what he saw while trying to stay alive in the middle of it. He describes the demand for quarter being made in the ordinary way by men who had grounded their weapons. He describes it being ignored. And then he describes what happened for the next 15 minutes, after American resistance had entirely ceased and the survivors were lying prostrate on the ground. The British dragoons and the dismounted infantry went over the field and killed them. Brownfield's specific detail is the one that has kept this account alive for 2 centuries, because it is not the sort of thing a propagandist invents. He describes soldiers moving among the fallen and driving bayonets into anyone showing signs of life. And he describes something more methodical still, where men had fallen in heaps, one body across another. British soldiers used the points of their bayonets to lever the corpses on top aside in order to reach the living men trapped underneath. That is not the fog of war. Levering a dead man off a wounded one in order to stab the wounded one is a deliberate act that requires time, attention, and intent. Now, how much should we trust Brownfield? This is the point where a lot of accounts of Waxhaws stop being history and start being cheerleading. So let's take the objection seriously. Brownfield was an American writing about British atrocities. He wrote well after the events, not on the day. His letter entered circulation in a context where American writers had every political reason to make Tarleton a monster. His prose is vivid in ways that suggest a man conscious of writing for an audience. All of that is fair, and all of it should make us cautious about treating any individual sentence as a transcript. Here is why the substance of his account survives the scrutiny anyway. First, and most importantly, Brownfield was not the earliest source. The claim did not wait decades to appear. On June 2nd, 1780, 4 days after the battle, before any propaganda campaign existed to serve, Abraham Buford wrote his official report, and in it he stated that roughly 2/3 of his casualties were inflicted after his men had attempted to surrender. That matters enormously for the chronology, because the standard objection to the massacre accounts is that they were written long afterward by men with a motive. Buford's report was written within the week. Whatever else one thinks of Buford, the allegation is on paper almost immediately. Second, Brownfield was not writing alone. Henry Bowyer, who served as an aide to Buford, gave his own account. Multiple American survivors, in separate documents produced over the following decades in places far apart, describe the same essential sequence. The flag ignored, the killing continuing after resistance had stopped, the wounded bayoneted on the ground. Their accounts are not identical, which is itself a point in their favor. Coordinated fabrications tend to match too well. Third, the British never really denied the substance. Tarleton's own explanation is not, "This did not happen." It is, "This happened because my men thought I was dead." That is a defense of motive, not a denial of fact. The most important British source on the killing concedes the killing. And fourth, this is the part that moves Waxhaws from a disputed atrocity story toward something better evidence than most. The wounds themselves testify. 2 survivors in particular left records so specific that they function almost as forensic exhibits. Lieutenant Thomas Pearson had commanded the American rearguard and was overrun in the opening moments, before the main line was even properly engaged. He went down early, which meant he spent the entire 15 minutes on the ground. The wounds he received are recorded in medical accounts because of how remarkable it was that he survived them. He was cut repeatedly across the face by saber. One stroke opened his nose and lip. The blow shattered the teeth of his upper jaw. His lower jaw was severed on both sides. He lived for 5 weeks afterward without being able to make a sound, taking milk drawn through a quill from a bottle because he could not swallow any other way. He survived. He was disfigured permanently, and he never fully regained the ability to speak. Set aside the horror for a moment and look at what the wound pattern means. Saber cuts to the face, delivered repeatedly, to a man who had already been unhorsed and was on the ground. That is not the geometry of combat between two men fighting. That is what happens to someone who is not resisting. Captain John Stokes was 24, an officer of the 2nd Virginia, and his experience covers the entire arc of the day. The fighting, then the thing that came after the fighting. When the line broke, Stokes was engaged by several dragoons at once. He had a small sword, which against cavalry sabers is barely better than nothing, and he used it. He parried a series of cuts aimed at his head before a dragoon severed his right hand at the wrist. He raised his left arm to shield his head. It was cut nearly a dozen times between wrist and shoulder, and his left forefinger was taken off. He went down. On the ground, saber strokes laid his scalp open from the crown of his head to his eyebrows. And then, as he lay there, a British soldier came up and asked him whether he expected quarter. Stokes said no. The soldier bayoneted him twice through the body and left him. John Stokes was carrying 23 separate sword and bayonet wounds, and by his own account, he never lost consciousness through any of it. He survived. He recovered as far as a man in that condition could recover. And years later, George Washington appointed him the first United States District Judge for the Western District of North Carolina. Read the exchange again, because it is the single most legally significant sentence in the entire episode. A British soldier asked a wounded, disarmed, dismembered man on the ground whether he expected quarter, received an answer, and then killed him for it. There is no version of the fog of war that produces that conversation. That is a man with time on his hands, making a decision. Now the statistics, because the statistics at Waxhaws are genuinely strange. Out of roughly 350 to 380 Continentals engaged, 113 were killed outright. 150 were wounded so severely that they could not be moved from the field at all, not wounded, but wounded past the point of transport. 53 were taken prisoner. That is 316 casualties. A casualty rate above 80%, and above 90% if you count the prisoners. British losses: 5 men killed, 12 to 14 wounded. Start with the ratio between American dead and American wounded, because that alone should stop you. In 18th century battles, the wounded typically outnumber the dead by a wide margin, commonly 3 or 4 to 1. Waxhaws produces a ratio close to 1 to 1, and even that understates it, because the wounded category here consists overwhelmingly of men too destroyed to be lifted onto a wagon. That distribution does not happen when two forces fight. It happens when one force stops fighting and the other keeps going. Then there is the British casualty figure, which is the number that really convicts. 5 dead. Against a force of 350 Continental regulars who delivered a disciplined point-blank volley into a cavalry charge and emptied saddles doing it. A battle in which one side loses 80% of its strength and the other loses 5 men is not a battle that was contested. The volley was the entirety of the American contribution to the exchange, and after it, essentially nothing was coming back the other way. But the most compelling evidence is not the battlefield tally at all. It comes from a source nobody at the time could have anticipated: pension paperwork. Beginning in the 1810s and expanding through the 1830s, the United States government established pensions for Revolutionary War veterans. applying required documentation, service records, sworn statements, and, for disability claims, descriptions of wounds. Old men in their 60s and 70s, scattered across the growing country, filed accounts of what had been done to their bodies half a century earlier. Modern researchers have gone through those files statistically, and Waxhaws stands out in two specific ways. First, sword wounds to the arms and hands. Across the pension records of the war, Waxhaws is the only engagement where these appear at a rate far above the statistical norm. Cuts to the forearms, the hands, the fingers. Those are defensive wounds. They are what a body does automatically when a blade comes at the head and there is nothing else to stop it. The same pattern a modern forensic pathologist would identify instantly. Men throwing their arms up. Men who were not fighting back, because a man fighting back is using his weapon, not his forearms. Exactly what happened to John Stokes. Second, and more damning, the combination of wounds. Waxhaws is unique among the war's engagements for the number of individual men carrying both saber cuts and bayonet thrusts. Of 32 pension applicants who recorded sword wounds from that afternoon, 17 also recorded bayonet wounds, more than half. For comparison, at Cowpens, a hard-fought battle involving many of the same units on both sides, exactly one man in the pension records carries that combination. Think carefully about what it takes to produce a man with both. Sabers were carried by cavalry. Bayonets were carried by infantry. For 17 men out of 32 to have both means that after the horsemen went through and cut them down, the foot soldiers came over the same ground and stabbed them where they lay. That is not chaos. That is a sequence. Cavalry first, infantry second, over the same bodies. And the operational picture matches perfectly. Cochrane's dismounted Legion infantry, who had been pinning the American left with musketry, would have advanced across the field once the line collapsed. The pension records, filed independently by old men who had no idea their paperwork would ever be aggregated, describe a two-stage process. One honest caveat, because this evidence is genuinely contested. The same body of pension files has been read the other way. Historians skeptical of the massacre narrative point out that, of the 50-odd Waxhaws applications, a great many contain no massacre claim at all. The applicants simply describe being wounded in a battle, with no mention of surrender being refused. That is a fair observation, and it does cut against the strongest version of the American account. What it does not explain is the wound pattern itself. Silence in a pension application is weak evidence of anything. Men applying for a disability payment were describing injuries, not writing history, and had no reason to editorialize. The distribution of the injuries is a separate and harder fact, and it is the distribution, defensive cuts to the forearms, saber, and bayonet on the same body, that points where it points. Chapter 13. Did he order it? Here is where honest history has to slow down, because this is the question everyone wants answered, and it is the one the evidence does not cleanly answer. Let me be precise about what is and is not in dispute, and let me be more careful than I was a moment ago, because there is a serious body of modern scholarship that would object to the way I have been framing this. The traditional account, the one I have largely been telling you, holds that a massacre occurred, that men were killed after attempting to surrender in numbers over an extended period. The revisionist account holds that no massacre occurred at all. That position is not fringe. It has been argued at length by historian Jim Peacuch, in a book whose subtitle calls Buford's massacre a myth, and by John Knight in a recent biography of Tarleton. Their case is worth stating properly rather than waving at, because a script that only presents the evidence for its own conclusion is not history. The revisionist argument runs roughly like this. Buford had an overwhelming personal incentive to describe a massacre, because the alternative description is that he deployed his regiment incompetently, gave a suicidal order, and then rode away while it was destroyed. A massacre narrative converts a professional catastrophe into a moral outrage, and it does so at no cost to him. Many of the surviving pension applications from the battle make no massacre claim whatsoever. The most vivid accounts were written decades later by men who had, by then, been living inside an established national story for a generation. And, the strongest point, a rout of infantry by cavalry naturally produces exactly these casualty figures, because cavalry riding down broken infantry in open ground is simply a very efficient way to kill people, without anyone having to refuse a surrender. There is also a British counterclaim that deserves an airing, because it appears in some accounts. It holds that the Legion believed the Americans had violated the truce, that firing continued after a flag had gone up, and that Tarleton's horse was shot during that interval. On that reading, the Legion's fury was not lawlessness, but a response to what they took to be a breach of faith by the other side. I do not find the revisionist case persuasive, and I want to explain why rather than simply asserting it. The claim that this was an ordinary cavalry rout founders on duration and on the wound pattern. Riding down fleeing infantry does not take 15 minutes on a static field, and it does not produce a population of survivors in which half the men carrying saber cuts also carry bayonet thrusts. Cavalry do not carry bayonets. Somebody walked over that ground afterward. The claim that Buford invented it to cover himself is weakened by how quickly the claim appears. 4 days in an official report. And by the fact that inventing an atrocity would not actually have protected him from the charge of mishandling his regiment. He was examined regardless. And the truce violation defense has a specific problem. It does not explain a British soldier standing over a dismembered John Stokes, asking him whether he expected quarter, and bayoneting him for the answer. Nothing about a disputed flag produces that conversation. So I come down where most current scholarship comes down. Something happened at the Waxhaws that went well beyond the ordinary violence of a cavalry charge. But you should know that this is a genuine historical argument with capable people on both sides. And if anyone tells you it is settled, they are overselling. Granting all that, the harder question is narrower. What was Banastre Tarleton's relationship to what happened? There are 3 positions worth taking seriously. Position 1, he ordered it. This was the American view at the time, and it became the popular view for 2 centuries. In its strongest form, it holds that Tarleton deliberately made an example of Buford's detachment to terrorize the Carolinas into submission. The honest assessment is that there is no direct evidence for this. No order was recorded. No British participant ever described receiving one. No captured document, no letter, no memoir mentions it. And the timeline actively works against it. Tarleton was under his horse during the critical minutes. A man pinned beneath a dead animal in the middle of a melee is not in a position to command anything. If you want to believe he ordered a massacre, you have to believe he ordered it in advance, and nothing survives that suggests he did. Position 2. It was the fog of war. This is the defense Tarleton mounted, and it has serious modern advocates. The argument runs: a genuinely unusual combination of accidents removed command from both sides simultaneously. The false report of Tarleton's death enraged troops who had ridden 105 miles in 54 hours in extreme heat with almost no sleep. Men in that physical state, in the confusion of a melee, are barely rational. And the killing was over before anyone could reassert control. There is real substance here. The exhaustion was real and severe. The rumor was real. The command vacuum was real and genuinely unusual. It is rare for both commanders to be removed from a small battle within the same minute. But the defense has a hard limit, and the limit is time. 15 minutes. A frenzy explains the first 30 seconds. It explains men cutting down Ensign Crute without registering his flag. It does not explain a quarter of an hour of methodical work. It does not explain levering corpses aside with bayonet points to reach the men underneath. And it categorically does not explain a soldier standing over John Stokes, asking him a question, waiting for the answer, and then killing him. 15 minutes is long enough to become aware of what you are doing. It is long enough for an officer, and there were plenty of officers on that field who were not under a horse, to intervene. And nobody did. Position 3. Command responsibility. This is where most serious modern scholarship has landed. And it is the least satisfying position emotionally, and the most defensible one factually. The principle is straightforward, and it long predates the 20th century. A commander is responsible for the conduct of his troops, not merely for the orders he gives, but for the discipline he instills, the standards he enforces, and the pattern of behavior he permits over time. By that standard, Tarleton's position is very weak. This was not an unknown unit behaving unpredictably. The British Legion had been credibly implicated in serious excesses at Monk's Corner 6 weeks earlier. Plunder and assault, bad enough that another British officer wanted men shot for it, bad enough that the accused had to be removed. Tarleton knew what his men had done. He had commanded them through it. He remained in command of them afterward. So when the same unit committed a far worse atrocity 6 weeks later, the question is not whether he gave an order. The question is what he had done in the intervening weeks to make sure it would not happen again. The answer appears to be nothing. And there is a further point, uncomfortable and worth stating plainly. Tarleton built his entire military method on speed, aggression, and shock. That method worked. The pursuit to the Waxhaws is a masterpiece of it. But a unit trained and rewarded for relentless aggression, ridden to physical collapse, and never disciplined for excess, is a unit being actively shaped toward exactly this outcome. You cannot cultivate ferocity as an operational asset and then disclaim it when it exceeds its brief. Consider one final piece of evidence, which is what he did afterward. Tarleton did not investigate. He did not court-martial anyone. He did not report the incident as a disciplinary failure. He wrote it up as a victory, which by the metrics of his army it was. The last Continental Regiment in South Carolina, destroyed at a cost of 5 men killed. He was praised for it. And when he wrote his memoir 7 years later, he defended his soldiers' conduct rather than distancing himself from it. A commander who genuinely believed his men had committed an atrocity beyond his control had remedies available. Tarleton used none of them, so probably no order, certainly no restraint, and afterward, no accountability of any kind. Whether that makes him a butcher or merely a man who found butchery convenient is a judgment each viewer can make. What is not in serious doubt is that it made him, within weeks, the most effective recruiting sergeant the American cause had in the South. When the British rode away, they left the field as it was. They took their own dead and wounded, 5 and about a dozen, and they took 53 American prisoners, being the men in condition to walk. The rest were left where they had fallen. In fairness to Tarleton, that last decision was not simple abandonment. The badly wounded were released on parole rather than carried off as prisoners, which meant they were free to be treated by whoever could reach them. And there are accounts that he made some arrangement for their care before riding on. It is the one genuinely creditable thing in his conduct that day, and it belongs in the record alongside everything else. Around 150 men lay in that woodland alive and beyond moving, and the responsibility for them fell to whoever lived nearby. Who lived nearby were the Waxhaws settlers. The Waxhaws was a Scots-Irish Presbyterian community. First and second generation immigrants out of Ulster. Farming families who had come across the Atlantic and then down the wagon roads from Pennsylvania into the Carolina backcountry looking for land. They brought with them a set of memories about the British Crown that were neither abstract nor forgiving, and a church that functioned as the center of everything. They came out to the field that afternoon and began the work. 84 American dead were buried that day in a mass trench dug on the battlefield. 25 more, who lived through the night and died the following day, were buried in a second mass grave about 300 yards from the first. The 150 who were still alive were loaded onto wagons and carried several miles to the Waxhaw Presbyterian Church, which was emptied of its pews and converted into a hospital. There is a detail from that church that tells you more than any casualty table. Among the wounded brought in, the average number of distinct saber and bayonet wounds per man was 16. 16. Not one killing blow, not 2 or 3 from a fight. 16 separate injuries, on average, across 150 men. Among the local people who came to help were a widow named Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson and her 2 surviving sons. The Jacksons were a poor family and a committed one. Elizabeth had been widowed before her youngest was born. Her eldest son, Hugh, was already dead. He had fought at Stono Ferry the previous year and died afterward of heat exhaustion. That left Robert, who was 16, and Andrew, who was 13. Andrew Jackson would become the 7th President of the United States. I should be careful here, and I will be. Because this is a story that has been told for 200 years, and some of the telling has hardened past what the evidence supports. The tradition that the Jackson family nursed the Waxhaws wounded at the meeting house is long-standing and widely accepted, and Jackson himself connected his hatred of the British to this period of his life. Some of the more cinematic details attached to it over the years are less well documented. What is solidly established is that the Jacksons lived in that community, that the wounded were brought to that church, that the family were active patriots, and that what happened to them over the following 18 months was among the most brutal experiences any American president ever had. Because what came next is not in dispute. Not long after the massacre, Robert and Andrew Jackson joined the local militia. They were far too young to serve in the line, so they served as mounted messengers, boys on horses carrying information between partisan bands, which in the Carolina backcountry in 1780 was genuinely dangerous work. In the spring of 1781, both were captured by British dragoons. During their captivity, a British officer ordered Andrew to clean the mud off his boots. Andrew, 14 years old, a prisoner, refused on the grounds that he was a prisoner of war and entitled to be treated as one. The officer swung his saber at the boy's head. Andrew got his left hand up. The blade cut into his hand and into his scalp, and he carried both scars for the rest of his life. Robert refused the same order and was struck as well, more seriously. They were then marched 40 miles to the British prison camp at Camden, where conditions were what British prison camps in the Carolinas generally were: overcrowded, filthy, and diseased. Both boys contracted smallpox. Elizabeth Jackson walked to Camden and negotiated her sons out through a prisoner exchange. She got them home. Robert died 2 days later. Elizabeth had one son left, sick with smallpox and not yet 15. She nursed him until he was out of danger. And then, having lost a husband and 2 of 3 sons to this war, she left again, traveling roughly 160 miles to Charleston to nurse American prisoners held aboard the British prison ships in the harbor. Those ships were among the most lethal places in the war. Prisoners were held below decks in numbers that guaranteed the spread of what contemporaries called ship fever, the disease we now identify as typhus, carried by lice in exactly those conditions. Elizabeth Jackson contracted it and died there. She was buried in an unmarked grave, and her son never found it. Andrew Jackson was 14 years old and had no family left alive. You do not have to be a psychologist to draw the line from that to the rest of his life. The war took his mother, both of his brothers, and left him marked physically before he was old enough to shave. 34 years later, in January of 1815, he commanded the American force at New Orleans and inflicted on a British army one of the most lopsided defeats in its history. Roughly 2,000 British casualties against a few dozen American. It made him a national figure, and it put him on the road to the presidency. The Battle of Waxhaws did not create Andrew Jackson, but it began the sequence that destroyed his family, and everything about the man afterward, the ferocity, the grudges he never released, the absolute unwillingness to yield a point, has its origin in that backcountry settlement in 1780 and 1781. The British came south to convert the Carolinas. In the Waxhaws, they produced a president who would spend his career being nobody's idea of a friend to Britain. Judged purely as a military operation, the Waxhaws was an unqualified British success. Tarleton had located a retreating enemy several days ahead of him, closed 105 miles in 54 hours through appalling heat, correctly assessed that his exhaustion mattered less than his speed, bluffed a superior force into standing still, designed a 3-column attack that dismantled a linear formation, and annihilated the last organized Continental Regiment in South Carolina at a cost of 5 men killed. In London, it was received exactly that way. Tarleton became a celebrity. Sir Joshua Reynolds painted him, helmet, green jacket, the whole theatrical apparatus of a dashing cavalry officer. And the portrait hangs in the National Gallery to this day. He would eventually be elected to Parliament as a member for Liverpool, where he would spend a considerable portion of his political career defending the slave trade his family had profited from. But in the Carolinas, the same 15 minutes produced something the British had not planned for and could not undo. 2 words entered the language: Tarleton's quarter. It meant no quarter. It meant that surrender was not on offer, that a raised hand or a grounded musket bought you nothing, and that the ordinary rules that made 18th century warfare survivable had been withdrawn. The man himself was recast. Whatever his actual conduct that afternoon, Banastre Tarleton became, in the American imagination, a byword for butchery. And the reputation traveled far faster than any accurate account of what had happened. A point of precision here, since it is one that careful historians raise and most popular accounts get wrong. The nicknames now universally attached to him, Bloody Ban, the Butcher, the Green Dragoon, are difficult to trace to any contemporary source. They appear to owe a great deal to a popular 20th century biography that supplied them, after which they entered general circulation and became, retroactively, what everyone knew he had been called. What genuinely does date to 1780 is the phrase Tarleton's quarter. That one is real, it is documented, and as we will see, men shouted it on 2 later battlefields. We should be clear-eyed about this. What spread through the Carolinas that summer was a propaganda campaign, and it was conducted with real skill. Patriot leaders and Whig printers understood immediately what they had been handed. Accounts of the massacre were circulated amplified, and in places enlarged. Brownfield's testimony was reproduced. The most vivid details, the bayoneting of the prostrate, the ignored flag, traveled from settlement to settlement ahead of any correction. That it was propaganda does not mean it was false. This is a distinction that gets lost constantly in discussions of this battle. The Waxhaws was both a real atrocity and an expertly exploited one. The evidence indicates the killing happened substantially as described. It is simply also true that the Patriot cause put that fact to work with considerable professionalism. And it worked because it landed on ground that had already been prepared for it, by the British themselves. Weeks after the Waxhaws, Sir Henry Clinton issued a proclamation that ranks among the most self-defeating documents of the war. After Charleston fell, surrendered patriots had been released on parole. They gave their word not to take up arms again, and in exchange, they were left alone. It was a workable arrangement. Thousands of men had accepted it and gone home, and every one of them was, functionally, a neutral. Clinton's proclamation canceled those paroles. It declared that the men released under them were no longer merely obliged to refrain from fighting. They were now required to take an active oath of allegiance to the Crown and, if called upon, to serve in the Loyalist militia. Read what that did to a South Carolina farmer who had surrendered at Charleston and gone home. Yesterday, he was out of the war. Today, he must swear loyalty to the king and be prepared to march against his own former comrades, or be treated as a rebel. He had exactly two choices, and one of them was to pick up a rifle. So here is the position the British had constructed for themselves by the summer of 1780. The Southern strategy depended on a population that could be persuaded, or at minimum, left neutral. Instead, the British had just demonstrated at the Waxhaws that surrendering to them might not be survivable, and then announced by proclamation that neutrality was no longer permitted. They had removed the two safest options available to an ordinary Carolinian: stay out of it or give up if things go badly, while simultaneously making the third option, fighting, look considerably more attractive. The backcountry rose. Partisan bands that had been small and local began attracting men in numbers. Francis Marion, operating out of the swamps of the PD, built a command that British columns could never pin down, and that eventually strangled their supply lines and communications. Thomas Sumter, who had come out of retirement after British troops burned his home, raised a force that fought a series of ferocious engagements across the middle of the state. Neither of these men could beat a British army in the field, and neither tried. What they did instead was make the interior of South Carolina ungovernable. Loyalist recruiting parties were ambushed, supply convoys were taken, outposts were isolated. Every garrison Cornwallis had planted to control the backcountry became a place that had to be defended, rather than a place that projected power. The Southern strategy did not fail because the British lost battles. Through most of 1780, they won nearly all of them. It failed because the strategy required a cooperative population, and the British spent that summer systematically manufacturing enemies. The bill came due in October, on a wooded ridge 60 miles from where Buford's men were buried. The outrage over the Waxhaws had traveled further than anyone expected, over the Appalachians into the Watauga settlements of what is now eastern Tennessee. The people living there were beyond the frontier, beyond effective government, and largely uninterested in the war. They were also, culturally, out of the same Scots-Irish stock as the Waxhaws settlers, connected by kinship and church networks that ran across the mountains. Major Patrick Ferguson, the Loyalist militia commander, the same officer who had reportedly wanted Legion soldiers shot after Monk's Corner, made the mistake of sending them a message. He warned that if they did not desist from opposing British arms, he would march over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste. It was intended to intimidate. Instead, it functioned as a summons. The over-mountain men assembled. Frontier militia, riflemen, men who had spent their lives shooting for food and fighting on their own terms, crossed the Appalachians and went looking for Ferguson. They caught him on October 7th, 1780, on a wooded hill called King's Mountain, where he had taken a position and dared them to attack it. They attacked it from every direction at once, moving from tree to tree using rifled weapons that outranged Loyalist muskets. Ferguson was shot from his horse and killed. His command, roughly 1,000 men, was surrounded and beaten in about an hour. And when the Loyalists tried to surrender, the Americans went through them. The cries recorded from that hillside were, "Remember the Waxhaws, and give them Buford's play." For a period, quarter was refused. Men attempting to surrender were shot down. It took repeated intervention by American officers to stop it, and even then, a number of prisoners were hanged in the days that followed after summary trials. There is nothing to celebrate in this, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. King's Mountain is the moment the Waxhaws came back around, and what came back around was not justice. It was the same behavior in the other direction, performed by men who had convinced themselves it was owed. This is the mechanism by which the convention of quarter breaks. It is not abandoned by decision. It erodes reciprocally. One side refuses it, the other refuses it in return, and within months neither side can extend it safely because neither expects to receive it. The Carolina backcountry in 1780 and 1781 became one of the most vicious theaters of the entire war. A place where the fighting was between neighbors, where farms were burned as policy, and where prisoners were frequently not taken by anyone. Strategically, King's Mountain was a disaster for the British. Ferguson's force represented the Loyalist militia that the entire Southern strategy depended on, and it was destroyed in an afternoon. Cornwallis, who had begun advancing into North Carolina, lost his western flank and had to withdraw back into South Carolina. His first invasion of the North was over. 3 months later, the wheel came all the way around to Tarleton personally. In January of 1781, at a grazing ground called the Cow Pens, Tarleton was sent after Brigadier General Daniel Morgan's detachment. Morgan understood exactly who he was fighting and exactly what that officer would do. Tarleton would come fast, he would come straight in, and he would not scout carefully first. So Morgan built a trap out of that certainty. He put his militia in front with instructions to fire 2 volleys and withdraw, knowing the militia would break and knowing that Tarleton would read the withdrawal as a collapse. Behind them, he placed his Continental regulars, hidden by the ground. When the British came on hard after what they thought was a beaten enemy, they ran into a line of regulars at close range and were hit in the flank by cavalry and by the same militia, reformed and brought back around. It was over quickly. The British Legion was shattered as a fighting formation. Tarleton lost the great majority of his command, killed, wounded, or captured, and escaped with a handful of horsemen. And as American cavalry rode down the fleeing British, the cry went up again: Tarleton's quarter. A number of British soldiers attempting to surrender were cut down before officers regained control. Cowpens is generally regarded as the tactical masterpiece of the war on the American side. It is worth noticing that Morgan's plan worked because of who Tarleton was. His aggression, the exact quality that had produced the 105-mile pursuit and the destruction of Buford's detachment, was the lever Morgan used to break him. The same temperament, applied against a commander who had thought about it in advance, was fatal. Tarleton never recovered his effectiveness. He continued to serve, he was present at Yorktown that October, and he went home with the rest of them. Banastre Tarleton lived a long time and was never called to account for anything. He returned to England as a celebrated soldier, published his History of the Southern Campaigns in 1787, a book that spends a considerable amount of energy on his own vindication and on criticism of Cornwallis, and entered Parliament for Liverpool. He served there for over 20 years, during which he was among the most persistent parliamentary defenders of the slave trade, arguing against abolition on behalf of the commercial interests of his city and his family. He was made a baronet, and later a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath. He rose to the rank of full general. He died in January of 1833 at the age of 78, in comfort. In America, he remained the butcher for 2 centuries, and the reputation has proven remarkably durable. It has also, at times, been unfair in its details. A great deal has been attributed to him that he did not do, and the popular image of him has been shaped as much by later fiction as by evidence. But the core of it was earned on one afternoon in May of 1780, and he never once, in 53 subsequent years, expressed regret for it. Abraham Buford survived and spent the rest of his life carrying the Waxhaws. His conduct was formally examined, and he was cleared. That is not quite the same as being vindicated. The finding was that he had done nothing culpable, which is a lower bar than saying he had done the right thing. He continued to serve in the Continental Army through the end of the war. Afterward, he moved west to Kentucky, where he farmed, bred horses, and lived until 1833, dying, by coincidence, in the same year as Tarleton. History has not been kind to him, and I think it has been somewhat unjust. Buford made one clear, identifiable error, the order to hold fire to 10 yards, and it was a serious one. But he was also a competent officer, handed a genuinely impossible situation. A slow column, irreplaceable stores, a fugitive governor, hostile country, no support, and the fastest cavalry commander in North America on his heels. The decision he is most criticized for after the order, leaving the field, is one that a number of officers on both sides made in similar circumstances without becoming bywords for it. He is remembered as the man whose name became a battle cry for a slaughter he did not commit. Captain John Stokes, the man with 23 wounds, had the most remarkable subsequent life of anyone on that field. He recovered, as far as such a thing was possible, and studied law. He became a respected attorney in North Carolina, despite having lost his right hand. In 1790, George Washington appointed him a United States District Judge, and he served until his death 4 years later. Stokes County, North Carolina, is named for him. He is one of the very few men in American history to have a county named after him substantially because of what was done to him rather than because of anything he did. Dr. Robert Brownfield, whose letters shaped everything we believe about the Waxhaws, returned to South Carolina and practiced medicine for decades. His account, written to Judge William Dobine James and published in James's biography of Francis Marion, became the primary source that carried the massacre into American historical memory. Whatever we conclude about its embellishments, the fact remains that without one surgeon's mate deciding to write down what he saw, this battle would likely be a line in a table of engagements. Governor John Rutledge, whose capture was one of the objectives of the entire pursuit, reached North Carolina safely and kept South Carolina's civil government alive in exile for the next 2 years. He returned to office when the state was recovered, later served in the Continental Congress and at the Constitutional Convention, and was appointed by Washington to the Supreme Court of the United States. He escaped by a matter of hours. The men in the mass graves are, with very few exceptions, anonymous. 84 in one trench, 25 in another 300 yards away. Most of their names are not recoverable. They were Virginians, mostly young, who had marched 400 miles to relieve a city that surrendered before they arrived, and who were killed on a road going home. Two physical legacies of the Waxhaws survive, and they could hardly be more different in character. The first is a set of flags. When the American line collapsed, the British Legion took the regimental colors of the 3rd Virginia Detachment, the complete stand of 3, the main battle flag and 2 smaller division colors. Tarleton carried them back to England as trophies, and there they stayed, in the possession of his family and their descendants, for more than 200 years. The main flag is gold-yellow silk. Painted on it is a beaver felling a palmetto tree, with a blue canton bearing 13 silver stars. In 2006, Sotheby's sold them at auction in New York. Together, the 3 brought $5.1 million. They constitute the only complete surviving set of American regimental colors known from the Revolutionary War, which is a strange and slightly bitter fact. That the most complete surviving artifacts of the Continental Army's regimental identity survive precisely because they were captured, taken abroad as a souvenir of a massacre, and preserved as evidence of a British victory. The second legacy is a stone in a field. In 1860, 80 years after the battle, local citizens erected a 10-foot obelisk of white marble over the mass grave holding 84 of the dead. The inscription they carved into it does not attempt neutrality. It names Tarleton, calls what happened a cruel and barbarous massacre committed after the surrender, and states plainly that this is where the American war cry originated. It closes by quoting a British historian's own admission that, at this battle, the virtue of humanity was totally forgotten. Over the following decades, the monument was steadily damaged by souvenir hunters chipping pieces off the marble. A small, grubby indignity that says something about how monuments actually fare. In 1955, the Daughters of the American Revolution erected an identical replacement beside the original so that the inscription would survive. The 2 stones stand together now on a 2-acre site in Lancaster County, South Carolina, preserved as a historic district. There is a fence, a small parking area, and a road going past. It is a quiet place. Nothing about it suggests what it is. We started with a number, 5. 5 British soldiers killed against 316 American casualties. That ratio is the whole battle, and it is the reason we are still talking about a 15-minute engagement between a few hundred men on a back road in 1780. Waxhaws changed very little militarily. The Continental presence in South Carolina had already been destroyed at Charleston. Buford's detachment was a remnant. Erasing it altered no campaign and took no ground that was not already taken. What it changed was the terms. Before that afternoon, the war in the South was a contest between armies, fought under a set of conventions that both sides largely honored, in which a beaten man could put down his musket and expect to live. After it, in the Carolinas, that was no longer reliably true. And once it stopped being reliable, it stopped being available to anyone. The British could not extend quarter and be believed. The Americans would not extend it and be believed either. Kings Mountain proved that within 5 months, and the partisan war that followed proved it for 2 more years. There is a lesson buried in this that has nothing to do with the 18th century. The British came to the Carolinas with a plan that depended entirely on winning over a population. Every piece of the strategy, the outposts, the Loyalist militia, Ferguson's recruiting, the whole apparatus, rested on the assumption that ordinary people could be brought over, or at least left quiet. it was not a foolish assumption. There were genuine loyalists in South Carolina, in real numbers. And then, over the space of about 6 weeks, the British demonstrated at the Waxhaws that surrendering to them might get you killed, and announced by proclamation that staying neutral was no longer permitted. They won the field and lost the country. Tarleton destroyed a regiment and handed the American cause the one thing it had been unable to manufacture for itself: a reason for undecided people to pick a side, and a phrase short enough to carry from farm to farm. That is the thing about atrocity as a military instrument. It is efficient in the moment and almost impossible to contain afterward. It does not stay where you put it. It travels, it gets exaggerated, it gets answered, and eventually the people who used it find it being used on them. As Tarleton discovered at the cowpens, listening to his own name being shouted by men riding down his soldiers. 113 men are in 2 trenches in Lancaster County, South Carolina. There is a marble obelisk over one of them, with an inscription that has been quietly and continuously accusing the same man since 1860. Buford wrote that he would defend himself to the last extremity. His men did. And then, for 15 minutes after the last extremity had passed, the killing carried on anyway. Which is the part that got remembered, and the part that lost Britain the American South.